Hello. I saw on the cover of some of the papers today, national papers, that new legislation is being proposed by the Home Secretary Theresa May to make it a criminal offence to use emotional abuse in relationships, which includes controlling behaviour. Now, predictably, the overtones of this are aimed solely at men. The language is a bit more diplomatic. It's talking about domestic abuse, but it's quite clear from what I've seen so far that this is really aimed at men rather than universal. Just a quick word on the actual legislation itself. I need to look at it in detail, but in itself I don't think it's a bad thing. There are people out there who are basically bullies and who will try to control their partner in an unacceptable way that goes well beyond anything that can be considered reasonable. This might be excess jealousy based on paranoia. For example, maybe someone constantly asking what their partner is doing if they're going out, that sort of thing, to the point where it can be incredibly controlling. That is destructive. It can be potentially as destructive as domestic violence. So it is a serious issue, and therefore in itself it's good that the government's taking this seriously. But naturally, and not surprisingly, it seems to be geared solely towards men, male abusers, and seems to completely ignore the fact that women are also capable of this. Now, predictably, the Labour Party has come out and said, this is a quotation from The Guardian: "The Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper welcomed the move, but said the coalition had presided over a backward slide in action against domestic violence and support for victims. Under this government, refuges across the country are cutting services and many are threatened with closure," said Cooper. "Prosecutions and convictions as a proportion of recorded domestic crime are falling, and over the last 4 years over 10,000 perpetrators of domestic violence have been handed only community resolutions, with many simply being asked to apologise to their victim." That's talking about actual violence. Polly Neate, chief executive of the charity Women's Aid, said the change, if implemented, could help victims greater confidence to speak out sooner. "This is a vital step forward for victims of domestic violence," she said. "2 women a week are killed by domestic violence, and in our experience of working with survivors, coercive controlling behaviour is at the heart of the most dangerous abuse. This move demonstrates a strong commitment from the Home Office to listening to the victims of abuse in framing the law that serves them." Now, I've nothing inferior against Polly Neate or Women's Aid. That what they are saying is true. Sadly, there are men out there who abuse women, and who those statistics are sobering. But the problem with solely focusing on domestic violence and abuse against women, which is unfortunately still the case, is that the abuse against men gets massively overshadowed. Now, overall, it's very difficult to know what the true statistics are. Maybe it is the case that more women are killed, and only an idiot would deny that that is a real problem in society. There are thugs out there who abuse their wives and girlfriends, but you know what, there's also some very callous and cruel women who think that they can abuse their men. There have been famous examples. Roger Moore, who played James Bond, his first 2 wives subjected him to abuse. That was reported in the press not long ago. In England and Wales, as far as I know, there is not a single refuge for men. There may be one, I'm not sure. But you know, Yvette Cooper is talking about government cuts to women's refuge centres, and that's obviously a problem. But Yvette Cooper and the Labour Party have nothing to say about providing refuges for men, because the Labour Party, I believe, is institutionally sexist, and it's institutionally driven by the very sort of divisive approach that modern feminism takes. This is a critique that I've had of feminism before. Now, just in case anyone is going to call me a misogynist or whatever, I'll repeat again: domestic violence against women is a real problem. It's an abomination, and of course it's right that the government takes action against this. I hate men who abuse women, but I also have contempt for women who think that they can abuse their men. In point of fact, I have contempt for anyone who treats the person they're supposed to love with abuse and with control. Now, importantly, the legislation says this is not about couples having arguments. Couples argue all the time. It's a normal thing. In fact, it would be a bit strange if couples didn't argue. You wouldn't want a Stepford wife sort of situation where a wife is constantly obeying her husband, or I'm not sure what the male equivalent would be, but if a husband is constantly grovelling to his wife, of course there's going to be an argument. That's natural. I think it's adult. It's normal. In fact, I'd even argue it's healthy to get differences out of the way. But there is a fine line between that and controlling someone else. I just think that another problem with this is how exactly is it going to be policed? I mean, it's difficult enough to prove domestic violence cases, although they certainly happen. How exactly do you prove emotional violence? I mean, you could have someone's word for it, but in the end of the day, that's all it is. And by the way, that's not victim blaming. I'm just pointing out the fact that it's going to be difficult to police. So I'm not sure if they've looked at that and how they're going to go about that. And there is a possibility here that whilst there is certainly legitimate cases of abuse going on, there could also potentially be a case where one partner has lost their temper and they feel hard done by in a heated argument. Then in a fit of rage they go to the police and accuse their significant other of that sort of abuse. So that's going to be a grey area. And of course men are going to get the raw deal, because it's much easier for a woman to be seen as a victim than a man. That's indisputable. That is indisputable. It's a lot harder for male victims of domestic or emotional violence to come forward. I'm not saying it's easy for women, but it is definitely easier. And when you have senior politicians like Yvette Cooper basically being silent about the issue of male suffering, that's shameful. Now, the Labour Party has consistently and routinely ignored the fact that there are men's issues out there. Obviously this isn't a man's issue, but likewise it is not uniquely a woman's issue. You can throw statistics around as much as you want, but in the end of the day, abusive people are male and female. Victims are male and female. And this legislation should be universal. Now, I've looked at the report in The Guardian, and to be fair, it doesn't exclusively mention women. It says the latest statistics reported in the crime survey for England and Wales suggest that 30% of women and 16% of men will experience a domestic violence abuse during their lifetime. But again, it's going to be very difficult to gauge this sort of statistics. I mean, that's only reported cases. The reality is going to be a lot higher, unfortunately. So I'm not being overtly negative. It is good that this legislation is being put forward. It is good that it is being taken seriously. But my concerns is A, how is this going to be policed? And B, the fact that once again it seems to be exclusively directed at men. I mean, like I said, I'm often against women's aid charity, because it is a legitimate issue in society. But what I do oppose is this notion that some women aren't also capable of emotional abuse. And for the record, to give a glaring example, is the blatantly biased family court system. I read in the paper today, which is very unusual that they would even give it attention, but the writer of Captain Corelli's Mandolin, best-selling novel, I forget the guy's name, but he has spoken out about the institutional sexism of the family courts. Now, why is this relevant to this issue? It is relevant because there can be few more grotesque forms of abuse than a loving father being denied access to his children by a vindictive woman who just wants petty revenge by using children to do that. And I think that's utterly despicable. That surely is an extreme form of emotional violence. And statistics aren't available, but it is quite easy to imagine that dozens of men have ended their lives out of sheer despair and desperation from the pressure they're put under by the family court system and the shameful sexism that is within the system. Now, I'm not a father, I haven't personally experienced it, but I have heard many accounts, and I have no reason to believe that they aren't true, of fathers taking extreme measures and in some cases ending their own lives. That is a form of emotional violence. So why is it Theresa May and Yvette Cooper and other female politicians, not that I want to turn this into a man versus woman issue, but why is it they are silent about that? Why? I'm so fed up with this. And it's not that this isn't coming from a masculist point of view. I don't regard myself as a masculist. I believe in equality. I believe in women's rights. I believe in men's rights. I believe in human rights. And this is good legislation in itself, but if they're going to come out with statistics about how many women are killed each week, let's have statistics about how many men take their lives because of the biased family court system. And it's shameful that not a single major party in Britain today seems to be discussing this issue. Or if they are, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen a single major party, whether it be the Tories, Labour, Liberal Democrats or UKIP, which are Britain's four main parties right now, bring up the issue of fathers' rights. Or if they have, it's been pretty muted. And that is an utter disgrace. When you consider this is a major issue that does impact many men. Whatever your views on the matter, it is an important issue. And by the way, it isn't a case of men versus women, because there's many women that support these causes. Indeed, there's many women who have grown up without a father, who have seen their fathers be persecuted by this biased system, and who support the campaign. There's girlfriends of fathers whose ex-wives are just vindictive. And the reality is that whilst there are certainly thuggish men out there who think that they can bully and control their women, that's shameful. As a man, I think that is shameful. And I've had female friends who've been through that, so in no way would I dispute that. But the fact of the matter is there is also women who use emotional violence. I know I'm going slightly off on a tangent here because it's not the UK, but I mentioned the boxer Arturo Gatti. There was allegations that his girlfriend, I have to say they are only allegations, but if it's true, it's an example of the sort of thing that some women do. He was a boxer. Apparently she called him a loser inside and outside the ring. Now that is the sort of emotional abuse that some women are guilty of, which is just as destructive as any sort of emotional abuse a man could use. I mean, that's one of the worst things you could say to a man, especially a man who's in a trade like boxing. To call him a loser, that's just, I think that's utterly despicable. So the rhetoric in this debate, once again, it ignores the fact that there are vindictive, callous and cruel women out there who are just as capable of emotional violence as men are. By the way, I would also argue that cheating, this is something we don't really talk enough about, but cheating, I would argue, is a form of emotional violence. Now, I don't want to get all puritanical, but if someone is they feel that they're in a loving relationship, they are trying their level best to treat their partner with fairness and with affection, and especially in the case of marriages, then they turn round and find out their partner is having an affair. That really is a form of emotional violence. It's utterly despicable. And like I said, I don't want to get all puritanical, but it's an example. And just because we don't have severe laws in this country, and I'm certainly not proposing that we do, that you would get in certain Islamic states, which should be under scrutiny because quite often they are very dubious charges. But what I'm trying to get at here is something like cheating really should be seen as a form of emotional violence, especially when you've had a case of, there was a radio show a few years ago called Danny Dumps. I had mixed views on it, but basically the concept was the radio host would catch out people who were cheating on their loved one. In one case, there was a woman, she'd been dating a guy for 5 years, and he had a marriage proposal for her, but shortly before this he found out she had been having sex with her boss. Now this woman actually had the audacity to ask how much the ring was. They basically tricked her into believing that this ring was for her and so on. Check it out, it's called Danny Dumps. I think it was someone called Amy. Now whatever you think of that, it does demonstrate the sort of emotional abuse that cheating causes. You can imagine being in love with someone for years, only to find out that they are giving love to someone else, and you have trusted them, you have shown them love, you have tried to treat them fairly, you've been there for them, etc, etc, etc. I really think that is as bad as violence. I really do. And like I said, I'm not trying to say I'm holier than thou or anything like that. I've got my faults, but I do draw a red line at something like cheating. I just think that is, if you're not happy in a relationship, then get out of it. The only caveat I would have is if someone is in an abusive relationship and they see no way out, and someone else has come in and sort of been their saviour. I do think that's different. But if you're in a relationship where you aren't a victim of violence or control or anything like that, and you go and fuck around, then you are then guilty of emotional violence. It's despicable. So I guess I'm bringing a lot of issues into this, but it is important, I guess, to have debate on the subject. And I have no problem in theory with the legislation. I just think it should be, the rhetoric should be more universal. By all means target men who abuse their partners, but also target women, because women are equally capable of it. And I just think it's bullshit hypocrisy that the rhetoric is only targeted at men. And of course it's so predictable that the likes of Theresa May and Yvette Cooper only talk about men who are guilty of this. And so do leading political parties. It's just a disgrace.